Hello, dear colleagues, dear friends, welcome everyone to the Leuven seminar in classical German philosophy. In this difficult week, we were considering even to postpone the event, but then we decided it could be important to do it, maybe in order to focus on something else for a couple of hours and also to strengthen the ties in our international research community and be there for each other in the best way we can. So today we are happy to receive here Gabriele Gava, who is Associate Professor of Theoretical Philosophy at the University of Turin. His main areas of research are epistemology, modern philosophy, especially Kant, and American pragmatism, especially Charles Peirce. And in 2019, Gabriele was awarded the Kant Nachwuchspreis of the Kant Gesellschaft and the Fondazione Silvestro Marcucci. In 2013, he won the Peirce essay contest of the Charles Peirce Society. And for a monograph on Peirce, Peirce's Account of Purposefulness, a Kantian Perspective, published by Routledge in 2014. And apart the monograph on Peirce, he has published several articles in important philosophical journals, such as C.I. Lewis, Kant and the Reflective Method of Philosophy in the British Journal for the History of Philosophy, and Kant's Synthetic and Analytic Method in the Critique of Pure Reason and the Distinction between Philosophical and Mathematical Synthesis in the European Journal of Philosophy. He is currently, as you may know, completing this forthcoming monograph that we will discuss today, namely Kant's Critique of Pure Reason and the Method of Metaphysics. So following Gabriele's talk, we are happy to have Karin de Boer as a respondent. Karin de Boer is a professor of philosophy at KU Leuven, and her research is concerned with transformations of metaphysics in modern philosophy and in contemporary continental philosophy. Her research is especially focused on Kant's theoretical philosophy and German idealism. And she is the author of 3 monographs, Thinking in the Light of Time, Heidegger's Encounter with Hegel, published in 2000, On Hegel, The Sway of the Negative, published in 2010, and recently this important contribution to the Kant research, Kant's Reform of Metaphysics, The Critique of Pure Reason Reconsidered, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. Karin also recently co-edited the volume, The Experiential Turn in 18th Century German Philosophy, published by Routledge, and published, of course, several articles in important journals on Kant's philosophy and other major figures of classical German philosophy. So the structure of our seminar today will be the following. Gabriele will present the 3rd chapter of his book for 10 to 15 minutes. The text was available at the website of the Leuven seminar, and if you didn't have the opportunity to see it, I will post a link here in the chat. So Gabriele will talk for 10 to 15 minutes, then Karin will respond for 10 minutes, and Gabriele will have the opportunity to reply to Karin and for 5 minutes, and afterwards we will then discuss for about 1 hour. As usual, try to use this raise hand function in Zoom during the discussion. And if you cannot do it for some reason, just publish in the chat and I will be attentive. So thank you so much, Gabriele, for kindly accepting the invitation. We are very much looking forward to listening to you today. So please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank Luis for the kind introduction, and to you, to Karin, and to all the group, the Leuven group, so working on German classical philosophy, for the invitation. I'm really glad to present my work here, even in this difficult time, as you mentioned. And I'm sure it will be very helpful to have your feedback on the project. So I'm in the phase of completing the manuscript, but I'm still in time to make some corrections. So that's about the right time. So I was mentioning before, I'm also interested to hear what you think of the introduction that I also included in the file I shared, because that's really the first draft of the introduction, and I'm also interested to hear if it is effective in making clear what the main idea of the book is and why it is relevant, and so on. So I'm really looking forward to it. So I prepared a PowerPoint. So I'll share it. Okay, everybody can see it? Okay, so I'll just so focus on what I take to be, I think, good claim to focus on for the purpose of the discussion. So I won't go into the details, assuming that you have read the chapter and the introduction. I just focus on what I take to be the main claims and what I think is important in the book. So before I start talking about the chapter on the metaphysical deduction in particular, I'll say a couple of things on the book in general. So the main claim of the book is that the Critique of Pure Reason should be read as the doctrine of method of metaphysics, and of course one then ask immediately when one says or make this claim, what does that mean? And so I don't think that doctrine of method, the main purpose of the doctrine of method is that of identifying methodological rules that are to be used in a particular discipline. Rather, the purpose of a doctrine of method of a particular discipline is different. So the main purpose is different. And I take it to be that of showing that a certain body of cognition is a science, and it does that by establishing that it has what Kant calls architectonic unity. And I think that architectonic unity is not simply systematicity. So establishing that a science as architectonic unity is not simply establishing that it organizes its cognition systematically. Architectonic unity is more than systematicity. And in fact, I take it to be not only necessary, but also sufficient for science. So that if we establish that a body of cognition has architectonic unity, we thereby establish that it is a science. So it is true, though, that doctrine of method also identify methodological rules that are to be followed in a particular discipline or body of cognition, but this is only instrumental for achieving the main aim of a doctrine of method, which is establishing that discipline is capable of architectonic unity. And these explain also a claim that Kant makes with respect to doctrine of methods, that is that they come at the end of a science. So if the purpose of the doctrine of a doctrine of method is show that a body of cognition has a certain kind of unity, so it is easy to understand why we need to have those cognition first, or at least some of those cognition first. So this is just to say something on the main claim of the book. And I think, so reading the critique in this way can help us solve at least two puzzles. So I hope more than two, but just to focus on two claims that, and two puzzles that you find in the introduction. So the first puzzle is basically that Kant, in a couple of passages, calls the critique a treatise or a doctrine of method, and it is not clear what that means, especially because it does not seem that critique or the main purpose of the critique is to identify methodological rules to be followed in a discipline or another. So, but if we then clarify what a doctrine of method is and what its purpose is, we can then make sense of those passages, even though the critique then only partially focus on establishing these methodological rules. And the second puzzle I think my reading can solve is concern the relationship between transcendental philosophy and the critique of pure reason. So Kant speaks about both this discipline within the critique, especially in the introduction, and it is not clear how they relate to one another, because it seems that there is much overlap between the two, actually. And so reading the critique as a doctrine of method of metaphysics can help us understand how they relate to one another, exactly because doctrine of method rest on the establishment of at least some part of the discipline of which they are a doctrine of methods for pursuing their aims. So that I take transcendental philosophy to be the part of metaphysics that is partly established within the critique, and transcendental philosophy is instrumental for the critique to pursue its aim as a doctrine of method of metaphysics. So this is just to identify 2 points on the book in general, and we can then move to the chapter on the metaphysical deduction in particular. So, I take metaphysical deduction to be arguments that are fundamental within transcendental philosophy. So between that part, that discipline, so within transcendental philosophy as one discipline that is established in within the pages of the Critique of Pure Reason. And then if we focus on what transcendental philosophy should do, on what transcendental philosophy is, so we can say that transcendental philosophy should investigate what Kant calls pure concepts that have a fundamental role for our cognition of objects in general. Okay, in pure concept here are concepts that do not contain anything empirical. It is not the case that the whole of transcendental philosophy is established within the pages of the Critique of Pure Reason. I think only part of transcendental philosophy is established there, and this is the part that concern what Kant calls Stammbegriffe, which is translated in the Cambridge edition as an ancestral concept. I'm not sure that's the best translation, but I've not found really a better alternative, so I kept it for now. And so I take ancestral concept to be pure concept, as it is the focus of transcendental philosophy, but let's say a subgroup of pure concept for the cognition of object in general. And these are concepts that are at the basis of synthetic a priori claims. on objects. Okay, so what should then the part of transcendental philosophy that is established in the critique of pure reason do with respect to this concept? Well, first of all, it should identify them and track their origin. And second of all, it should prove that they are objectively valid, or at least that they have some sort of validity. And I take to be the task of the metaphysical deduction to perform the first task, so the identifying and the tracking, and the task of transcendental deduction to prove the objective validity of those concepts. So this is just to place the chapter on the metaphysical deduction within the project of the book. So if we focus then on the chapter on the metaphysical deduction, what are the main claims, the more general claims that I make that are also, let's say, original with respect to other view? Well, I think one original claim I make is that all main parts of the transcendental doctrine of elements contain metaphysical deduction. So there is a metaphysical deduction in the aesthetics, there is a metaphysical deduction in the analytic, and there is a metaphysical deduction in the dialectic, which means that transcendental philosophy is not only to be located in the analytic. Okay, so there are analyses of concepts that belong to transcendental philosophy also in the aesthetic and the dialectic. And so a second claim that I make is that this deduction do not only assume, but also contribute to establishing a distinction between faculties. So it's not the case that they simply start by saying we have three different faculties: sensibility, understanding, and reason, and then just look at the way we use a faculty to identify the concept or the representation that is that originates in the use of that faculty. So I think that the deduction so contribute to establishing a distinction between faculties, and also to understand what is specific about a certain faculties. And also I think that a consequence of the fact that they want to then show that so what is different about the origin of this concept and representation is that they actually follow very different methods. So, and this is especially true if we focus on the metaphysical exposition of space, for example, or of time, with respect to the metaphysical deduction of the categories and of ideas. So just to give you a concrete example of the claim I make with respect to one of the deduction I take into consideration, we can focus for a moment on the metaphysical exposition of the concept of space. And there, with respect to it, I make a number of claims. And the first is that so the fact that the Kant calls the exposition an exposition of the concept of space should be taken literally. So Kant starts his analysis from our concept of space, and we do have a concept of space. So it's not the case that we only have an intuition of space. However, I do not think that all that the metaphysical exposition do is simply provide an analysis in a strict sense of the concept of space, so that what the result of the deduction is simply obtaining analytic knowledge based on the concept of space. I think that the metaphysical exposition provides an analysis of the concept in a broader sense, which also takes into account our use of the concept in synthetic a priori judgments. And it is exactly by analyzing our use of the concept of space in synthetic a priori judgments that the deduction is able to track the origin of our concept of space in a different mode of representation. Okay. In this way, also, it helps us to determine the nature of the faculty through which we have this different mode of representation. So, and the example I use in the chapter is the judgment space is singular. So I think, I believe that for Kant, this judgment is synthetic. So it's not the case that we can so justify the judgment by simply appealing to our concept of space. So we need to have an explanation of how we arrive at the judgment space is singular. And in order to do that, so the strategy that Kant follow is to attend to the way in which we represent parts or relationship in space. Okay, so we regard the whole of space as originally given and the parts as obtainable only through limitation. And so this way, it is by focusing on this way of representing space that we can, on the one hand, so discover a different way of, so we can track a different mode of representation of space, which is the intuition of space, and also see that through that mode of representation, we have a mode of representation of part relationship that is totally different from the way in which we represent part for relationship through concept. And this is then a way of also determining so what the faculty of sensibility is, because we determine so fundamental way in which through that faculty we represent parts for relationship. Okay, so I think I can stop here. So thanks. And I'll leave then more time for discussion.
Thank you very much, Gabriele, for this stimulating presentation. And now Karin de Boer will then have the floor to respond to it. Karin, please.
Okay, yes, thanks for this, Gabriele. I read the introduction and chapter 3 with great interest. I think it's really very interesting and stimulating, and I look forward to seeing the book in print. So as you probably know already, I agree with many of your more general claims or your general approach to Kant and the critique of pure reason in particular. But I would like to focus on some points that I find somewhat controversial and that I think are especially worthwhile to discuss. So maybe I start from a more kind of general comment. So I think what is really important in your book is this claim that the critique of pure reason as a whole is indeed a doctrine of method for metaphysics, and that for this reason we find within the critique of pure reason various strands. Yes, because as you also pointed out in your introduction, in order for Kant to clarify the conditions under which metaphysics can become a science, he needs to already carry out metaphysics to some extent. Yes, he has to have a content or to produce a content that is part of, let's say, first order metaphysics, in order to clarify the limits within which metaphysical cognition is possible, the principles, etc., the various parts, etc., etc. So I think that is that's clear and that's important and maybe not sufficiently appreciated by other commentators. Yes, that we have these two strands in all parts of the critique of pure reason. Okay, so in fact, I completely agree with this overall distinction between, let's say, a constructive strand of the critique of pure reason, which is what I would call first order metaphysics or transcendental philosophy, and on the other hand, the let's say the more reflective question as to the conditions under which this very metaphysics can be fully established as a science. Now, it seems to me that more specifically, you focus a lot on one task of the doctrine of method, namely to show how the science can obtain architectonic unity. And it seems to me that that this emphasis somehow marginalizes the properly critical aspect of the critique of pure reason. And so you say that page 8, the main task of the critique of pure reason is positive, yes, and has to do with establishing this architectonic unity, or maybe to put it in a better way, to show how metaphysics can be construed along these architectonic lines. And so my first question is, why do you marginalize the properly critical role of the critique of pure reason? Yes, because the book is called a critique. Yes, it's not called architectonic of pure reason. Yes, that's just a small section. And so I can see that many other parts of the critique of pure reason contribute to establishing this architectonic unity. But there are also parts of the critique of pure reason that clearly have a more critical role to play. And so a second question related to the first one is, how do you see or how do you, as it were, think that the metaphysical deduction and the transcendental deduction carry out these dual tasks? Yes, so there is transcendental philosophy qua first order metaphysics or investigation into pure concepts, and then there is transcendental critique. And so I was not completely clear as to how these two strands, the constructive one and the critical one, map onto the metaphysical deduction and the transcendental deduction. And I personally think that the transcendental deduction has a critical aim. And I guess that you would disagree with this. And maybe, yeah, so I'm not sure about metaphysical deduction, but in any case, I wanted to ask whether you think that the two strands can be mapped onto the various deductions. Okay, and then well, I'll try to be brief. Then I'd like to ask a kind of general question with regard to the distinction between method on the one hand and content on the other hand. And so my question is, well, where does the one end and the other begin? Yeah, because in your chapter 3, you very nicely go through these various metaphysical deductions. And then at the end, you have a kind of a relatively short section on the method that Kant employs in this context. And while I was reading your text, I was wondering, well, how exactly does your account of these metaphysical deductions differ from alternative accounts of these various deductions that do not present themselves as accounts on the methods? And maybe part of your answer would be, well, I take method not to be, concerned with the question, well, how exactly does Kant proceed? But I think this should be part of the story. Yeah. And so there's one more point I want to make to specify this, because it seems to me, so it's clear that you want to emphasize the differences between all these various metaphysical deductions. Yes, and I suppose you probably do the same with regard to the transcendental deduction. So, and that, to be honest, I found somewhat unsatisfactory. And I think you have a point, yes, that the way Kant proceeds in all cases is different, at least to some extent. Yes, why? Because the content is different. Yes, sensibility, the understanding, reason. So in each case, a different type of deduction is required or possible. But I would say that if we lose sight of what all these deductions have in common, then we might also threaten to lose sight of something that I think is, really a part of Kant's method in the classical sense. Yes, how he proceeds in all cases. And so, yeah. So my question is, so what remains of a kind of methodology that Kant employs in these various contexts? And so, yeah, I should have said earlier on that I agree with you that we cannot, interpret everything that Kant does in terms of transcendental arguments, for instance. Yes, so there is not a kind of one overall method that is applied in all cases. But maybe you turn a bit too much to the other extreme by emphasizing all these differences. And I felt like, where is the method? Yes, what is it that these various analyses have in common? And I think that, for instance, you can see that Kant clearly start in all cases, at least in the case of the analytic and the dialectic, starts from a consideration of a purely logical use of the faculty, then turns to the purely intellectual use of that very faculty in relation to anything whatsoever, and then turns to the more specific question, well, how is this faculty employed in the case of appearances, and how is it employed in the case of noumena or things in themselves? And so I think that there is a certain logic to the metaphysical deductions that one can recognize. And as said, I had the feeling that that you, as it were, downplay this common structure. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Karin, very much for the question. So maybe I'll start from the last one, just because it is the most difficult to answer. And I get your point. And I think, so I think it is true that when I analyzed then the metaphysical deduction, the transcendental deduction, given also the focus of the main book, one expect maybe something more to be said on the method. And so the chapter really focused on providing a reconstruction of these arguments. And then, so maybe somebody would expect more regarding the general consequences about the method. And I think one reason, because the chapters are structured in this way, is that when I first started to work on the book, I didn't really distinguish between two ways, clearly distinguish between two ways in which the issue of method is relevant for the book. So in the first sense, it is relevant for the question of the critique as a doctrine of method, but their method is meant not in a usual way. So it has to do with what I take to be architectonic unity, and then we would not describe it as clarifying the method of a science normally. So it's another understanding of method. And I think then the guiding idea of the book is actually that one. And so for this reason, so the question of method understood as a procedure of argument or investigation is so it's not so central in the structuring of the chapter, especially on the metaphysical deduction and the transcendental deduction too. So I get your point, and so when you say that maybe there is something more to the unity of these arguments, that could be true maybe regarding the metaphysical deduction of the categories and the ideas. And there, I think there is this line, I mean, starting from the logical use of a faculty, and then what we can call the real or intellectual use, and so on. So and I say something on, because I got this objection on the already. So I say something now in the last paragraph on the relation between the two. But if you then consider part of metaphysical deduction also the parts on space and time, then they do not fit that picture. Okay, because I mean it would be hard to then clarify what would be an intellectual or logical use of the faculty of sensibility. But of course, we have a concept of space and time. So before we clarify what those concepts are, we cannot really locate it in the faculty of sensibility. So I see your point. But I think that, so maybe I should emphasize more the connection between categories and ideas on this part. But I think that it is still true that there are important differences, especially if one consider also the metaphysical deduction of the concept of space and time. And so as for the unity in general, so what I think is the case is that the unity is not given by the procedure that is followed by the different so deduction, but it's given by the purpose that they all follow. And we can identify that purpose when we have an idea of what transcendental philosophy is in general. And I think that focusing on the critique of pure reason as a doctrine of method of metaphysics, and in that respect also of transcendental philosophy, so actually help us identifying those aims. So the focus on, so reading the critique as a doctrine of method of metaphysics is an instrument in that respect to see the unity of these different deductions. So that would be my answer to your last point, but I recognize that at least on the part I want more on the method is not satisfactory. So to go back to the other question, so the first one was, so I focus maybe too much on architectonic unity, and so the critical element of the critique is downplayed. So in the book, in the part that concerned the method of the critique of pure reason, I distinguish between a negative task and a positive task, or a negative side and a positive side. And so I claim that so one purpose of the critique is clearly to set limits to some of our cognition and to the use of some of our concepts. and especially to those concepts that belong to transcendental philosophy. But I read that posing of limits with respect to those concepts as instrumental to the main positive aim of the critique in view of the architectonic. So that so saying that I can use the categories, the ideas, and the concept of space in time only in a certain way, and the use of those concepts as limitation is instrumental first to putting a stop to metaphysical disputes regarding to those objects, and especially how those different concepts are related to disputes regarding objects that are beyond possible experience. And so by putting a stop on those disputes, we are able to meet one minimal condition of architectonic unity for attributing an architectonic unity, which is coherence, basically. And so I agree that there is an important critical part to Kant's project, but I see it as instrumental with respect to the main purpose of showing that metaphysics can become a science. So, and with respect to the second point, so how do I see the relationship between the distinction between metaphysical and transcendental deduction on the one hand, and so transcendental philosophy and the critique of pure reason on the other? And so I know that you read that transcendental deduction as belonging to the critique of pure reason, and so I read it. I read transcendental deduction as belonging to transcendental philosophy, but I should clarify it. So I first put on the table my reading, and then some specification maybe. And so I take it that transcendental deduction, the part that belongs to transcendental philosophy, so have only a positive task. So just proving that some concept have validity with respect to a certain domain of object or in a certain understanding of those concepts and so on. So they are not the part that is that belong to transcendental philosophy is not focused on setting limits to those concepts. And I take, so what the critique does with respect to the argument that we find in transcendental philosophy as mainly drawing some negative consequences from those arguments. So I agree, for example, that within the transcendental deduction of the categories, you find both a positive argument that so prove that the categories have a certain validity, and a negative argument that draws some limits to that validity. But I attribute, let's say, the name transcendental deduction mainly as part of transcendental philosophy only to the positive argument, and I take then the role of the critique to be that of drawing those negative conclusion with a view to the the effect of those limits to the issue of the architectonic unity of metaphysics. So I see things in this way, and I think partial confirmation that this is the case comes from some passages where Kant so distinguishes between so let's say a positive argument and a negative argument within the transcendental deduction or regarding the categories, because it's not clear that it's all up in in the deduction. So I discussed these passages in chapter 6, and Kant seems to think, so we can clearly distinguish these two arguments, the positive one and the negative one. And sometimes he also suggests that to have the negative one, we do not actually need the positive one. We simply need the metaphysical deduction, actually. And so this is in a passage, I don't remember now, sorry, but it is as a response to a comment by Rhino, and he actually suggests that so the negative argument could maybe work without the transcendental deduction, which seems that then the negative task of the critique of pure reason does not fundamentally depend on the positive argument regarding the validity of the categories. So this is, but so I think that, so I partially agree with you. So if you mean that for example, in the chapter on the transcendental deduction of the categories, there is an argument, a negative argument regarding their validity, and I agree with that. So the disagreement only is that I place that argument not within the transcendental deduction itself, but as maybe a consequence that the critique draws from the positive argument. Thanks.
So thank you, Karin, for the questions. Thank you, Gabriele, for the answers. And now we are opening the floor for discussion. So please use this raise hand function if you have questions. And we have a question. Yes, Alexander Zata.
Thank you. Thank you, Gabriele, very much for the text. It was very intense, and I too had problems with distinguishing between doctrine and content, or method and content. And now I'm having problems with distinguishing between method, doctrine, and content, and metaphysics for that matter. I'll explain. As you say, the critique of pure reason is the doctrine of method itself, and it establishes the method that is to be followed afterwards. But then it seemed to me that you take it to mean that it somehow happens, so to speak, performatively. Correct me if I'm wrong. That Kant is following a certain procedure by establishing the rules of that very procedure. And this is so performative. But then I'm wondering how much is left then for the proper metaphysics, for the proper doctrine that is to follow the doctrine of method. And then concerning this as well, could you please tell a little bit more on the distinction between metaphysical deductions and transcendental deductions? I understand we didn't have the part where you discussed the transcendental deductions, and I'm also wondering how much is left after you discussed everything as part of the metaphysical deductions. Because it seemed to me that, so the way you define them, metaphysical deductions identify concepts that are candidates for meeting this characterization and determines their origin, and transcendental deductions, it's page 7. The transcendental deductions examine their validity. So it seemed to me that those positive and negative tasks do go hand in hand together, and I'm really not sure if you can say that you can do the former without the latter. And if so, how do we distinguish between them if we trace the origin while at the same time establishing the validity? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So if I understood correctly the first question, basically it can be put in this way. So it's if it is true that the critique of pure reason is the doctrine of method of metaphysics, and as such it should clarify what procedure we should follow in metaphysics. And if it is true at the same time that in order to do that, it rests on the establishment of parts of metaphysics. So it means that within the critique, we are both doing metaphysics while we are at the same time clarifying how we should do metaphysics, right? Yeah, so I think this is partially true, but not completely true if we then consider the fact that it is not the case that what Kant does in the critique of pure reason rests on the establishment of the whole of metaphysics. Okay, so for example, so one methodological rule that Kant identifies in the discipline of pure reason is that we should not provide proofs of what Kant calls so cognition from pure reason. We should not provide transcendental proofs, it says, so which concern then cognition, so rational cognition that are not mathematical, basically. If we do not base that proof on a previous transcendental deduction of the principle that we use in the proofs, okay? And so you might say this in part is a rule that Kant actually applies in the transcendental doctrine of elements, because of course it does provide a transcendental deduction of the categories, for example, but it's also a rule that we should follow in the parts of metaphysics that are not yet established. So for example, if we take the metaphysical foundation of natural science, so Kant regard those, the kind of synthetic a priori judgments that are analyzed there as depending on the principle that he proved in the first critique. And so if we apply that rule to that part of metaphysics, which is not established in the first critique, that means that we should not provide proofs regarding those concepts if we do not have previously provided a transcendental deduction on of the principle on which we base those proofs. So it is also, in this sense, it is a principle that concerns what we still have to do with metaphysics. Okay, this is regarding the first question. So what is the relationship between metaphysical deduction and transcendental deduction? So, so I take it, so if we consider, so we talked about the metaphysical deduction of space, for example, so in my presentation, right? So, and what the deduction establishes is that we do have an a priori concept of space. So it's not a concept that we derive from experiences. It's an a priori concept. This concept depends on a more fundamental way of representing space, which is an intuition. And so we have an intuition of space. We still do not know if through those representations, we represent something that really pertains to objects. And so the transcendental deduction should show that through our concept and intuition of space, we do represent something that really pertains to objects. Okay, and the strategy Kant follows, at least in the second edition, is to start from some synthetic a priori judgments that it takes to be cognition that are valid both for geometrical space and for empirical space. So he assumes that synthetic a priori proposition in geometry applies also to empirical space. And then show that we cannot explain, so our having those synthetic a priori cognition without assuming that we have an a priori intuition of space, which is exactly the one that it is identified in the metaphysical deduction. And since the concept of space that is analyzed in the metaphysical deduction is derivative with respect to our intuition of space, then also that concept can have validity. Does that make sense? How I see the relationship between the two? And
yeah, sure, totally. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's so both and. Until this point, so the argument is only positive. So the negative argument and this part is not part of what I take to be the transcendental deduction. And so what is the negative argument should do is establish that, so basically our, so through our representation of space, we only have cognition that concern object as appearances and not as things in themselves.
Okay. Yeah, Luciano.
Hi, Gabriele. Nice to see you. Thanks for the chapter and the introduction. It sounds very exciting, this project. I had a small question concerning your reading of the exposition of the metaphysical exposition as metaphysical deduction. And I mean, it's a very, maybe banal question, but why do you think that Kant calls it an exposition? I mean, he says at the beginning, before the transcendental deduction of the categories, that he had to provide a transcendental deduction of space because the use of the unrestricted use of the categories then make everything doubtful. But he doesn't call the metaphysical exposition metaphysical deduction. I mean, and I was wondering, why do you think he does that, and to what extent this is, let's say, the two terms can be equated? And what I have in the back of my head also is something that we find in the Critique of Practical Reason when Kant discusses the deduction of the moral law, and there he says, well, I could do this with the exposition, but I could not provide a deduction. There is no deduction of the moral law, and we, of course, this is very problematic. But there he seems to say, well, with such fundamental, let's say, principles or representations, we cannot have a deduction, but we only have exposition. So I was wondering, how do you see the matter with regard to space? So my space and time, of course. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. So I don't think I have a satisfying answer. So I think that it is legitimate to say that there should be a metaphysical and transcendental deduction that concerns space and time. And Kant says in the A edition, in the transcendental deduction, so he speaks of the aesthetic and say, I have already provided a transcendental deduction of space and time in the aesthetic. So it seems to mean that it could do that. And he says that that deduction concerns both the origin and the validity of the concept. But so it's weird to then link the transcendental deduction to the origin of a concept. One way to explain that is that in the other deduction, there is still no distinction between metaphysical and transcendental exposition. So that the two things are considered together, for example. And yeah, that's a way to explain it, at least. So yeah, so why exposition and not deduction? I mean, so there are people that insist on the fact that the exposition have to do with concepts. So take the word exposition to also be a so evidence for that, because so exposition, at least in the discipline, are those kind of the definition that are available or possible in philosophy, right? So they take it to be evidence that what Kant is doing is providing a philosophical definition of the concept of space and time, which just show what kind of analytic, so what are the marks, if you want, of the concept of space and time. But I get the point, but I don't think it, at least some of the property of space that are considered in the metaphysical exposition, at least, cannot be properties that they have as so only on the basis of the concept of space. And this, I think, is particularly then true for the transcendental exposition, where it is clear that Kant considers synthetic a priori cognition that are dependent on our representation of space and time. So I don't have a satisfying answer on that, but I think there are reasons to say that they cannot be only definition, that there should be something more. And regarding the passage in the second critique, so if I remember correctly, there Kant means transcendental deduction, right? So it's so the point is that we cannot have a transcendental deduction of the moral law, and so we can only have an exposition. So I think that maybe that can be a point against reading the transcendental exposition of space and time as a transcendental deduction, but not. It doesn't work so well, I think, against reading the metaphysical exposition as a metaphysical deduction, because, I mean, in the context of the critique is that of the second critique, the idea is that we cannot provide really a proof of the validity of the moral law. We should simply take it as a fact, right? And so here the choice of exposition cannot be because we cannot prove the validity, because simply a metaphysical deduction has not to do with validity. So I would answer this way, but I see the possible problem there. Maybe, I mean, don't remember now, but it could be that Kant uses also this distinction in the third critique too, right? And he says, I can, in some context I can provide an exposition but not a deduction. Maybe there is some expert on the third critique that can help with that. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, thank you, Gabriele. Luciana Martinez?
Yes, I think that in the first part of the critique of judgment, he stated that he has provided an exposition of beauty as sublime, and then he provides a deduction of the a priori principle of taste. But I do not remember which is the argument why this a priori principle is only related with the beauty and not with sublime. Perhaps in this argument we can find an explanation of the difference between an exposition and the deduction, because we have an exposition of sublime, but there is no a priori principle for sublime to be deducted. But yeah, I don't know.
Thanks. That's helpful, and I think that that confirmed though the view of the second critique. So the talk of deduction is also related to transcendental deduction then, and so the point is that I could not provide a deduction of a certain principle. I could only provide an exposition. If that works against my view, it should work only against the reading the transcendental exposition as a transcendental deduction. But thanks. I'll keep this in mind. Thanks.
Nice. Luigi Filieri.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Oh, thanks, Gabriele. So I got two questions. The first one concerning these the latter point we're discussing right now. So it might be that you are reading deduction as a general justificatory strategy, and since it deals with three different standpoints, we need different names. So the exposition is an exposition in the aesthetic, I would say, because it has a justificatory character, but it's dealing with forms and not with concept. So in that case, the question of the application has a different status than in the deduction of the categories, because in the one case you have forms and you can expose them. In the other case, you have rules and you have to justify the application they use. And it could be so also with reference to the second critique, because in that case, again, the justification has to take another form, because there we begin with principles and not with elements. So the first point is already the synthetic principle and not the elements upon which we build the synthetic principle. So that would just be a suggestion to make sense of the name you use for what is a deduction and what is an exposition. And my second question is a request for clarification. So as you were answering to Karen's comments. So on the one hand, you put a lot of emphasis on the concept of architectonic unity. But I've seen somehow, maybe I'm wrong, a tension with your characterization of the relationship between negative and positive arguments. So the question is, are we really dealing with two different kinds of arguments? Or precisely because your emphasis on architectonic unity, should we understand that no negative argument or positive can actually work without the respective positive or negative? So how can we put together the emphasis on the architectonic unity and then say the negative task does not need a deduction, and the deduction can do without the positive side and the negative side? That would be a question, attention I saw, but maybe I'm wrong. So first of all, I'm not sure of this and if I'm saying this correctly, but thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks both for the suggestion and the question. So I'll take the first just as it is, and I'll think about it. So as a possible way of distinguishing exposition and deduction. So I do not have a view on that, but I'll think about it. So regarding architectonic unity and positive negative distinction, so I think I would give, I just need some more light. So I would give a different answer if we consider what I take to be the positive and the negative argument regarding the validity of a certain Sternbegriff. And I think in that case, the two arguments can be more strongly separated, just because so my view is simply this. So if transcendental philosophy should be considered a part of metaphysics, that it has its autonomy and can be considered, can become a science with so a proof of the concept that are central to it, and it means that the positive argument regarding the validity of those concepts should have a place within the that part of metaphysics, or that section of metaphysics, without considering then the consequences of that argument for metaphysics in general. Okay, so this is how I think, how I see things on this point. But then I agree that so when we consider the negative part of the critique of pure reason and the positive part of the critique of pure reason, and I take it to be the negative part exactly limiting the validity of the concept that are of the concept of transcendental philosophy that are analyzing the critique. So I completely agree that the negative part should not be separated from the positive part, exactly because that limiting is done with the purpose of the architectonic in view, exactly to show that we can have a coherent metaphysics that has, so that can put a stop to metaphysical disputes on the one hand, and also on the other hand can make room for those commitments that are essential in view of the main principle of the practical part of metaphysics. And so I agree that in that respect, the positive and the negative should not be separated too strongly.
Nice. Henny?
Thank you, Gabriele, for your chapters and for your talk, your introduction. What is not clear to me is if you associate with metaphysical deductions completeness as se, or do you associate it only with the metaphysical deduction of the categories? Would you say that the metaphysical deduction of the transcendental IDs is also a kind of proof of completeness of them? And what in the case of the metaphysical expositions of space and time, if you interpret them as metaphysical deductions of these concepts, do they point to a certain completeness too? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's a good question. So so at least Kant raise explicitly the issue of completeness with respect to the categories and the ideas. I'm not sure it does that with respect to space and time. But yeah, it's probably, I think it's probably true that he wants to provide an exhaustive list of those concepts that he calls ancestral concepts. So the issue of completeness should be relevant. So for all the deduction. So what I think is that probably Kant thought it was easier to get completeness with respect to the what is normally required to his argument, especially in the with respect to the categories, yeah. So yeah, but I think that the issue, so that if the issue of completeness is relevant in the in transcendental philosophy, so we should get the metaphysical deduction within transcendental philosophy should be able to identify, to give a complete list of the different transcendental concepts with respect to the different faculties. Then it is an open question if he has then an argument to really prove that he got that completeness. So probably we should not, I think with respect, for example, to the categories, I think people put too much emphasis on the requirement of completeness, because it really seems simply that Kant thought it is easier to get completeness if we focus on judgments, because we do not really to take into account the particular content of the concept, but only the form of different judgments. And I think, and for that reason, it starts with judgments, or at least also for that reason. And we can disagree with that, but at least he has an idea, you might say, or a possible justification for the claim that he got completeness in the case of the representation of sensibility. It does not seem to really take the issue into account. So in that case, probably if there should be a claim of completeness, it's less justified, I would say.
And with respect to the transcendental IDs?
Yeah, I mean, so what I take the idea to be is that, so in the chapter, I see, I distinguish between two strategies to distinguishing between the classes of ideas, and one is based on the different kind of syllogism. So the idea is simply you have three different forms of syllogism. They are different ways of reaching the unconditioned. So from that we have three different forms of the unconditioned, and so we have three different classes of ideas. There is then another strategy which says, yeah, there are three relationships in a representation, so the relation to the subject and to the object, either as an appearance or considering itself or in general. And so when we have our idea of the unconditioned, we should apply it in these different domains, and so we get the three classes. So there is even there then an idea at the basis of the subdivision and of the idea that there are only these three subdivisions, but of course there are other problems. So what is the relation between the two strategies? Yeah, and so they are compatible, they are different. So I think there are a lot of problems there, but I think so there is at least a basis for the claim of completeness. At least it tries to do that, and it does not seem to try it in the aesthetics.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Now, Pavel.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. So it's just, I have a clarificatory question. So you say that metaphysics involves cognitions, and you provide some quotations from Kant to that effect. My question is basically how you're reading cognition there, because on one understanding, cognition involves a relation to an object, to an actual given existing object, and a determination of that object through the ascription of general properties, et cetera, et cetera. So that can't be how you're understanding it, because that would disqualify a large part of metaphysics as cognition. But if that's the case, then how are you understanding cognition? It must be in some weaker sense. And if it's, so I think one issue is when it's too weak, then it becomes indistinguishable from just, you know, any old representation. So there must be some sort of in between. And I agree that Kant thinks of metaphysics in terms of cognitions, but I can't make sense of what he means by cognition there. So yeah, how are you understanding that?
I mean, I take cognition in a fairly strong sense, I believe, and I think that so when we have so when we speak of cognition, then we have so a certain proposition that is valid for certain object, okay? And these are, so the main case of cognition or the basic cases of cognition for Kant seems to require that we have an actual, the two components are intuition and concept, that we have really an object that is given to us through intuition, to which we apply also a concept. I do not think that in metaphysics we do have cognition in this sense, but in the sense in which we have a priori cognition that on object. And so fundamentally proposition that describes how objects, at least if you consider transcendental philosophy, how object must be if an object is given to us. So it's basically a priori proposition that describes properties that object must have on the basis of our a priori concept for the cognition of objects. So I would say that, and it's true. So this is valid maybe for part of transcendental philosophy, but of course I say also that there is a space in transcendental philosophy for ideas, and of course ideas cannot be cognition in that sense. But so I think that defining, I do not say that ancestral concepts are ancestral concept of object. I do say that ancestral concepts are ancestral concept for the cognition of object. And I think that the idea, so within transcendental philosophy, we prove a validity of ideas, not because they are cognition, but because they are conditioned for obtaining some cognition of object. So if you take, for example, what Kant says on pure air in the appendix to the dialectic, so he seems to think that we would not develop the concept of pure air if we would not try to systematize our cognition using the ideas of reason as a guide. But then if empirical research proved that there is pure air, then that is a cognition that we would not have obtained if we would not have pursued a course of investigation using the ideas of reason. So they have a validity, but not because they are cognition, but they are condition for obtaining some cognition. And so this is a way in which, so they can have a place in metaphysics, even if they are not cognition themselves. And there is also, I think that actually within metaphysics, there are not only cognition, that there is space for proposition to which we commit for the role they play with respect to what we can call a practical cognition. So for example, we have a practical cognition that which content is the moral law. It seems that the moral law demands that we commit ourselves to God and the immortality of the soul for some reason. We cannot be convinced by that. But that then justifies us to commit ourselves toward the proposition expressing so the existence of God and the immortality of the soul, but and in a certain sense that should be part of metaphysics, but they are not cognition, of course.
Thanks.
Thanks, Gabriele. Steve.
Thanks. Hi, Gabriele. I look forward to reading the whole book as well. I have a question about your main concept of architectonic unity. You say on page 8 that it differs from mere systematicity. And I think that's because it should realize its idea. But it wasn't clear to me how this then differs from Kant's notion of a system as he sets it out at the start of the architectonic, which is a unified collection of cognitions under an idea, where the idea of the whole precedes the parts and so on. And in these passages, Kant is talking about systematicity and scientificity in the same breath, it seems. So I was first wondering about whether this distinction can hold. And then a related question was that you then say that metaphysics should realize its fundamental idea. But as far as I could see, you don't say what the fundamental idea of metaphysics is. So I was wondering what that was and how that might connect to the sort of natural tendency towards metaphysics.
Yeah, thanks. So I think that architectonic unity is different from systematicity because so it's true that both in the appendix, for example, we can get systematicity in relation to an idea of reason, and in the architectonic, Kant speaks of the architectonic unity of a science in relation to an idea of reason. But I think ideas play a different role in the two contexts, and so I think that in the context of the appendix, the idea seems to be that first of all, the context of the appendix is empirical research of nature. In the context of the architectonic, we have a priori cognition and the system of a priori cognition. And also in the appendix, I think that different ways of organizing the cognition of the understanding can equally satisfy the requirement of systematicity required by the ideas. I don't think that's valid for the architectonic because so I think so they are the idea of reason as the function of showing that the way in which we organize cognition is not arbitrary, but is the correct one. And I think you can see it if you consider the distinction between architectonic unity and technical unity. So technical unity is systematic, but simply the principle that we use to organize the different parts of a science is arbitrary. Is not the correct one, and I think for this reason architectonic unity is different than simple systematicity because it's not simply one possible way of organizing systematically cognition, but it is the way in which they should be systematized. Okay. What is the idea of metaphysics? What I take it to be is, so in the context, for example, of the appendix, Kant speaks of, for example, the idea of the soul as a possible unifying device for empirical psychology, right? And so there are people reading that idea as a possible candidate for the idea that should guide the unity of psychology, for example. But I think that the idea in the case of the architectonic unity is not just so one concept that we can put at the top maybe of the science as a first principle. I think that in the case of architectonic unity, it is a description of the whole science. So it is the correct description of the cognition belonging to the science and of their part-whole relationship. And so this justifies me, because since we do not have metaphysics, we cannot really know what the idea is. So we need first a way to have the actual metaphysics, then we can say what the idea is. It's a bit of a Hegelian reading of Kant, probably. But this is how I read it.
Good. Are there further questions? Konstantin Azarov, I saw that you had a question. It was answered. Yeah. Okay. Federico Dal Barco.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. You don't have a question, Konstantin? I can go. Yeah, because I saw the. Okay. Yeah, I can go.
Yeah, it was answered. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, thank you for the presentation, and the book was really interesting, especially from the point of view of a student. It was really useful, especially the introduction, to get into the whole chapter. My question regards the difference between the classical way to understand a method and the method that we're talking about here. The way to understand whether a set of cognitions can be a science through architectonic unity. And I was thinking about applying this method to other disciplines. If I'm not wrong, at a certain point you talked about logics and whether there should be a connection between this method and logic. But I was thinking about even other disciplines like, I don't know, maybe the other disciplines that are contained in the system of pure reason, like anthropology or the history of pure reason itself. But even maybe this is anachronistic, so I shouldn't even ask this. But nowadays we talk about political sciences and social sciences. So this new kind of method could be applied to these other disciplines. Does it make sense?
Yeah, so thanks. So I think, so if I understand the question correctly, is so basically if the perspective of a doctrine of method can make sense, and so the question also regarding the architectonic unity of a science can make sense for sciences that so that of which we talk today. And so I think one I don't know actually, but I think one point that is important is that I think if we read architectonic unity as I read it, it is important. And the idea of a science that provides architectonic unity to it is then the correct description of a science that for Kant should be, in a sense, given a priori already by reason, that means that I would say at least part of that science should be formed by a priori principle. So that would say that the question is not relevant then for purely empirical sciences. Why I say that? Because it is, if it is true that this idea is given a priori by reason, this idea should be a description of the science itself. So I read it so in this way. So it does not mean that we have an immediate access to those cognition. It simply means that insofar as those are cognition that are in our power, without appealing to empirical investigation, that means that on the one hand, we can get those cognition independently of empirical research. And if this is true, it seems also to mean that we can also get how those cognitions should be ordered without empirical research. And so the question of the architectonic unity of a science seems to be relevant only for sciences that are at least partially, so a priori, at least partially formed by a priori principle that we can then so get to without empirical research.
Thank you, Gabriele. I think that we can then close here the formal part of our seminar. As usual, we'll do an informal part, and you're all very welcome to stay to some informal discussions. And just an announcement, next week we'll have another session of the Leuven seminar with Dina Emmons from the Freie Universität Berlin, and she will talk about Hegel on contradictions. And I will just post the program of the Leuven seminar here on the chat so that you can take a look at it. And so thank you very much for this very stimulating discussion. And you are all very welcome to stay and to go on with the discussion in the informal part.
And thanks to all for the wonderful question. And it was really helpful and fun.
Nice.